Hello, welcome to Decode. Remember when robots were cute? When R2-D2 made cute little noises and Wall-E picked up trash? Okay, you can forget about that, because next time you see a robot, maybe that robot will blow your brains out. Today, in Decode, killer robots and the future of AI in the military. Since the 1950s, movies have been warning us about a reality, which was that one day we could create an AI with decision-making power, and that actually it was never a good idea to give that AI a weapon. The first instance of that is the classic movie The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1952. If you remember, it's that movie in which there's an alien called Klaatu, and Klaatu actually comes to Earth with a huge robot called Gort, and Gort is a lethal robot designed with one simple and cold logic, which is exterminate humans for the bad behavior we have had as a species. Later on in the classic 2001 Space Odyssey, HAL 9000 actually eliminated the whole crew to accomplish his mission. And of course, the classic of the killer robot kind of like trope would be Terminator, in which Skynet actually decides that the greater risk for the planet is actually humanity. We've seen that in Black Mirror. We've seen all sorts of reinterpretations of this myth of the killer robot. But in all these stories, there's a common idea, which is that robots lack empathy, and of course they have no doubt, no guilt, no pity. And so when we give a robot a weapon and the task to decide when to kill, they can be extremely cruel from our perspective as humans. And this is no longer science fiction. This is actually happening as we speak. So first of all, I want to talk about current weapon systems and future weapon systems, which are either autonomous or they are literally AI. The first one I want to talk about, we have all heard about it in the news. It's from Ukraine. The Russians are actually attacking Ukraine with one weapon, which is the Shahed 136, which is a drone made by Iran, and it's very cheap. It's a kamikaze-style drone used by the Russians. You need to think about this as a GPS-enabled flying bomb, basically, but the trick is that it's extremely cheap to manufacture. This is a flying wing design with a propeller on the rear. It's not very fast. It flies around 180 kilometers an hour, so 120 miles or so. It's about 3 by 3 meters, so the size of a very small car, like one of those smart cars. But check it out, the cost of one of these munitions is between $20,000 and $50,000 US. So that puts it in a kind of like negligible cost as weapons go. We all know that, for example, a jet fighter costs in the range of hundreds of millions to maybe even $1 billion, and this we're talking 20K, 30K, 50K. So that's literally nothing. They fly low, propeller driven, GPS navigated. They just go straight to the target and they explode on impact. But the trick is, because they're so cheap, they can be launched in swarms, and basically saturating the air defenses of the Ukrainians, and that's what has been going on. It's at the end of the day, it's one of those like terrorist car bombs, but just with GPS and flying. That's literally what it is. And again, as usual, we've seen this kind of behavior before. We saw this in World War II with the flying bombs sent by the Nazis towards the UK, the V1 and the V2 designed by Herbert von Braun, who would later swap size and go on to design part of the Apollo space program. This kind of weapons are terror weapons, when used in mass scale, because they have a huge asymmetry. Let me explain what I mean by asymmetry. To actually launch one of these Shahed drones, basically, again, as I said, it's about 20K to 50K. Okay, how much does it cost to stop it? Yeah, you can use a surface-to-air missile like a Patriot or something like this, but that's going to cost a fortune compared with the cost of the incoming weapon, you see? And so what happens is that these weapons have the ability to saturate the defenses of the enemy. The result, according to the Ukrainians, who keep track of this, of course, they say that around 28,000 of this drones have been launched so far against them by the Russians. So again, it's kind of like a throwaway weapon. They just throw them like like it's nothing. For the sake of comparison, again, I said Shaheds 28,000. It's estimated that the Nazis sent 10,000 V1s and about 3,000 V2s against the UK during World War II. So again, it's that same kind of a weapon. Is this AI? Not really. I know it's not that different from a classic missile, like a Tomahawk or something like this. Just much slower, extremely cheap, so it can be manufactured in a mass scale. But of course, the future looks at more deadly weapons with a more higher decision power. I want to talk about a company that's actually capturing a lot of space in the media, which is Anduril from the US. This is a company. It's a startup actually, so it's kind of like war as a startup mentality, which is kind of interesting. And it's founded by Palmer Luckey. Palmer Luckey being the founder of Oculus. You will remember him from the Oculus Rift. And so basically Anduril is kind of like a Silicon Valley type startup applied to warfare and AI. So that makes it a very, very unique case. They have a range of products, and this is really AI. So this is not the Shahed cheap drones, but this is something way more sophisticated. So for example, the first product on the range is called Lattice, and it's a war operating system that basically it can connect sensors and radars and satellites and cameras and weapons, munitions, so that it basically processes that data in real time and it can make tactical decisions autonomously, like tracking, identification of targets, prioritizations of targets, and of course deployment of munitions for those targets. All of this in milliseconds, no questions asked. And that makes it very, very interesting, but at the same time very, very scary. Again, a general on a battlefield, of course, he needs to process information. He's prone to certain types of errors, like human errors and stuff like that. But in this case, we're talking about an AI taking that kind of like seat of the general and basically being prone to other types of errors. What happens if it makes a mistake in identification? And instead of, targeting a Hamas terror group, maybe he's targeting a family. What happens if the system is hacked by an enemy force? Some sort of like a cyber terror attack against the infrastructure of this kind of like AI general. Again, so there's a range of problems that come with this new type of weapons, and of course Anduril not only has kind of like this commander kind of product, which is Lattice. It actually does have weapons. For example, they have the Bolt, which is the Bolt is basically a portable drone that can be deployed from a backpack. Really, really small and able to basically carry out attacks. And in this case, again, this is not a Shahed, so this is actually an AI-enabled drone with cameras, with identification. It can track targets. It can basically follow a target and explode because it's basically a bomb, upon contact with the target. And again, Anduril has a whole range of weapons. You can go to the website and check it out. Everything sounds very, very sci-fi, of course. And they have one of the main ones. It was just announced, and this is very, very, very interesting. It's called the Fury. The Fury. Just check it out on the website. I'm going to post some images here. The Fury is one of the first. This is not a drone anymore. So this is one of the first autonomous AI-enabled combat aircraft. So it's a UAV. So it's an unmanned aerial vehicle, but basically there is no pilot. And in this case, we're talking about something which is designed for dogfight and designed for real air-to-air combat. The speed is Mach 0.95, so almost the speed of sound. Flight ceiling 50,000 feet, and maneuverability of 9 Gs. And this is an interesting one, which is when you stop actually putting a human in the cockpit, basically, of course, you can do things which are much more aggressive in terms of their maneuverability or, different things, because you don't need to have a pilot and you don't need to care for the well-being of that pilot. The first flight of the Fury was in November 2023, and production is going to start in 2026. And the purpose of this new system platform basically is to replace the pilot with an AI. So again, as I was saying, we're moving in a direction in which the goal is not only to create new weapons, but basically to create an autonomous ecosystem, from the decision making, such as lattice, to the actual weapons, to towers that watch the battlefield, and sensors and vehicle making decisions. This is all a chain that's basically sensors, then data, then decisions, then fire. And that's the future of warfare that AI is actually showing us. But of course, the main difference being that in all this process, we're looking at a future in which there is no humans, in the chain of command. And of course, that's scary. And you may wonder, why are we doing this, right? I mean, because in sci-fi, they have been warning us, hey, this is not a good idea, So why are we doing this? I'm sure there's many engineers and military and civilians, of course, who are seriously reluctant about this path and thinking maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But here's the problem. The problem is either we do it or they will. And this brings us back to World War II again, and the race to the atomic bomb, basically very well portrayed, by the way, in the movie Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan. Basically, the US Army actually accelerated the development of the atomic bomb just of the fear that the Nazis could get there first. And that's what makes this kind of like environments or situations very, very deadly, which is, sure, many people think, this is not such a good idea. But you know what? If they get it first, that's a much worse idea. And because of this doubt, I'm assuming there's going to be a very rapid development of AI-enabled weapons. And of course, that puts it in a very uncomfortable scenario, But of course, every country is going to try to retain the leadership in the military battlefield of the future. And that's going to make stopping AI in the military very, very hard to do, because everybody's is going to try to stay, one step ahead of the other nations who may be developing weapons like this. So of course we're talking here about very, very different types of weapons with different types of capabilities. For example, the Shahed 136 drone manufactured by Iran and used very successfully by the Russians against the Ukrainian civilian population. It's basically not much more advanced than a V1 from World War II with a GPS module added on top. It just flies in a straight line to the target. It explodes on impact. The only thing is that the GPS gives it accuracy, whereas the V1s were just basically thrown in a dumb manner wherever they fell. But when we're talking about AI-enabled weapons, of course, we're talking about something very different. This is weapons that they can see with cameras, they can interpret what they are seeing, they can decide, and of course, they can make the decision to shoot. So this is not a missile anymore. It's an autonomous killer with digital eyes. And of course, this creates the concern of, who do we blame if an AI makes a mistake? As I said before, there's a chain of command in the military. And, if let's say a helicopter pilot, shoots a missile and by error, he kills a civilian family, of course, there's a chain of command or there's a chain of responsibility. What happens if that is done by an AI? Who's responsible for that? Of course, yeah, sure, it's the army of the country owning that weapon. But again, the chain of responsibility is diluted in the case that the decision was actually made by an AI. Who answers if the algorithm had a bug? Again, these things are new questions that we're going to need to find an answer to. What happens is that if that weapon system is hacked by the enemy, imagine a future in which you have a weapon designed for a certain purpose, but an opposing force basically somehow hijacks your weapon and uses it against you. Who's responsible for that? Why was there the possibility of that weapon being hijacked? Is that your responsibility because you left some sort of backdoor so that the enemy could actually leak in and hijack the weapon? You see, this is all new things that we're going to face because an AI does not have moral. The only thing it has is goals, and of course, the war of the future is going to look very different from the war of the past. I'm going to make a forecast of the stages that this war is going to go through. And honestly, it gets more scary in every stage. So check it out. In the beginning, what's going to happen is that, of course, the military is going to propose AI weapons as a way to save lives, and that will look like a noble goal, Of course, they will come and they will say, oh, you know what, if we send this drone or if you send this robot to the battlefield, that robot or that drone is actually a substitute for a human being. So basically, we're not risking that human being's life. So, there's going to be less casualties of war because we're going to send robots instead. And, that all sounds fine. In the beginning, we're going to think, oh, fair enough. Sure, there's going to be less wounded and less killed on the battlefield if we send robots. That sounds like a good idea. Sure. So that's going to be stage one. And, here things will look optimistic and, everything will look fantastic. What happens is that, of course, in stage two, the enemy is going to do the same. Because, of course, what the enemy doesn't want is our robots actually killing their people. So what they're going to do is that they're going to use robots as well. So basically, we're going to be in a future in which robots are going to basically fighting each other. When I mean robots, I mean all sorts of AI-enabled, weapons, because again, the same reason why the Americans don't want to send their soldiers to war is going to be the same valid reason why the Russians don't want to do it as well. And so most likely we're going to face a second stage in which war is going to be, dominated by robots on both ends of the trench, so to say, So it's going to be robot versus robot. And then at that point, we all know that warfare is an affair many times of bandwidth, bandwidth. If you look at D-Day, for example, D-Day was an operation all about bandwidth, like, okay, how many soldiers do we need in the south coast of England and how many ships to transport those soldiers so that we can overwhelm the German defenses on the Atlantic Wall in the Normandy coast, And at the end of the day, war, I know it sounds cruel, but it's a numbers game, I remember Norman Schwarzkopf, the famous US general, in one of his famous conferences, he was talking about the ratio of the two armies in any sort of military intervention. How many soldiers and how many tanks did you need to actually overwhelm an enemy force? And then when this comes to robots, it's not going to be soldiers anymore. It's going to be manufacturing capacity. We're seeing that again with the Shaheds in Ukraine. As I said, 28,000 have been launched. And you know why? Because they're very fast to manufacture, And so what's going to happen is that the war is going to become an industrial thing, really, like, okay, who can manufacture soldiers or weapons faster, So it's going to be less about very, very expensive munitions or very expensive projects and more about, okay, we need lots of cheap things that we can manufacture rapidly so our bandwidth actually overwhelms the bandwidth of our potential enemy. So this is the third stage. Again, so first stage is going to be, let's send robots so our people don't die in war. Second stage is all sides actually using robots for the same reason. Third stage is a war for bandwidth, who is faster building robots on a bigger scale. But then, of course, that's going to take us all the way to, here in DECODE, I like to use sometimes this expression of, I've seen this movie before, when a war becomes a matter of bandwidth, this begins reminding me a lot of World War I and the trench war, in France and Belgium and, in Central Europe. There was lots of trench war, and it was just basically who was able to send more cannon fodder to the trenches faster, to overwhelm the enemy. And the end result of that, we all know that because of the history books, was actually a stalemate, of basically, armies being stuck on the same trench for months and then years because no one was able to actually overwhelm the enemy, and that could be very much the situation in which we encounter ourselves when the war is actually dominated by machines, which is, sure, yeah, our machines are fighting their machines, but we're not making any significant progress. And of course, the temptation is going to be too big to say, oh yeah, the problem is that a war fought by machines does not make the enemy surrender, because if they have industrial power, they can keep going forever, basically, And so someone is going to have the idea of saying, okay, maybe we should direct those weapons towards humans. And that again takes me back to World War I and World War II. So if you remember, World War I was largely a trench war, and there was less civilian casualties. And then comes World War II, and when World War II comes, basically this is a war of terror, and terror in the form of V1 bombs actually being launched against the UK, and London specifically, and that was basically a campaign of terror trying to get the British to actually surrender. And it was actually terror the other way around, because, for example, when the US Army actually dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was actually targeting civilian victims, and the purpose of those bombs was actually to cause terror and to make the enemy surrender. You see? So this same logic of saying, hey, it's justified to actually target civilians in World War II in this case, because what we want is that we want the enemy to surrender, is the same logic that will be applied further down the line in the future when people say, hey, it's a valid target to actually use machines to target civilians, because we're not looking for an endless war among robots. What we're looking is a war that has an end because the enemy surrenders. And the only way to do that is going to be to use all our might and all our military, including AI-based weapons, to actually make the enemy surrender, So this is the last stage of this AI war, which is a war of terror, the same one as we saw on World War II, just more deadly, because we're going to have, more deadly weapons in the form of AI-enabled system. And this is really scary for a reason, which is once you enable AI to be a machine with the ability to kill, basically be careful, because an AI is going to be a much better killer than we are. And remember this, my training back in the day was as a game designer. I designed video games and I designed shooters and things like that, and actually when we do AIs for video games, and I know it sounds like a far off example, but it's not far off. As you'll see in a second, when we design AI for video games, actually we need to dumbify those AIs, because making an AI unbeatable by a human is actually very, very easy, And I think this is going to be exactly the same way. The task of aiming and shooting and, choosing locations for your weapons, etc. Honestly, from an AI standpoint, is a very, very simple problem. We have solved way more complicated problems, such as LLMs and ChatGPT and all that kind of stuff, So doing an AI that outperforms a human in a battlefield, honestly, it's a piece of cake, and that's going to make this AI-enabled weapons extremely deadly. Think about this. First, an AI, there's two characteristics that make an AI much better than a human. The first one is, of course, an AI is not human, which means, it doesn't tremble, it doesn't feel cold, it doesn't feel tired, it doesn't need to sleep, it can see in the dark, it doesn't suffer fatigue, it doesn't suffer PTSD when the AI sees a comrade fall dead. You see what I mean? So an AI is a perfect machine once it's targeted for a goal, which is in this case to kill. So first, an AI can be a much better combat soldier than a human. But the second reason why I think an AI is going to outperform humans really quickly on the battlefield is that basically an AI learns. And yeah, sure, humans learn, but not at the rate that an AI can learn. I mean, for an AI, every battle, every skirmish is going to be a class. It's going to be a lesson. And of course, connecting all those AIs among themselves, those AIs can merge strategies by applying learning, the same type of learning we see on ChatGPT, etc., so that every error becomes a piece of data and every pattern becomes a new behavior that the AI is going to learn in order to become a more efficient killing machine. So again, every episode of that AI is just going to make it better. And so if the AI by definition is going to be superior than a human because of all the factors that I stated before, it's going to become even more deadly once we factor in the idea of learning. In a matter of weeks and months, of course, an AI is going to make better decisions than a human, especially under stress, and especially because of this learning. I want to give you a very cynic but actually realistic example. Again, I'm a software guy, so I know what I'm talking about here. In software, we have this technique that we call A/B testing. A/B testing, we use it every day. For example, we use A/B testing to select our miniatures on YouTube. So whenever you see one of my videos, maybe you see different miniatures. That's A/B testing. With A/B testing, what you do is you test different scenarios and you pick the one that performs best. For example, the miniature that has more clicks in this case, right? We do use A/B testing for other things. For example, in the context of video games, you don't know this, but maybe when you download the next video game, you're seeing a version of an enemy, and then maybe one of your friends has a different version of that same enemy, and you don't realize that you're playing a different enemy. And what we're doing, kind of like behind the closed doors, we're analyzing the data of which of the two versions of the enemy generates more player satisfaction and generates better gameplay, etc. And then in a few weeks we will roll out an update with the best enemy. So again, that's A/B testing. Imagine A/B testing applied to a battlefield. Imagine that. Imagine an AI that basically by using A/B testing learns that whenever she needs to shoot at someone, it's actually better not to shoot to kill, but just to shoot to injure, to cause a kind of like a nearly fatal injury, but not an instant death. Because by doing that, basically the fallen soldier begins screaming because of the pain and because of the injury, and because of that, his teammates are going to basically rally to try to help that guy, and then the AI can perform a second shot and kill all the others. You see, this kind of behavior, which is a video game behavior, that's something that an AI on a real battlefield can evolve by A/B testing very, very easily. You see what I mean? I mean, not only an AI can have more precision, it can have zero fatigue, it can have zero concerns about ethics and all that kind of stuff, but because it can learn and because it can perform A/B testing, it can become much more deadly than a human, and of course that's a very scary thought. So you need to think about AI-enabled weapons as a sort of digital Darwinism, the same type of Darwinism we've seen, for example, in LLMs in the last 2 years. Think about the way ChatGPT or Midjourney or any of the other AIs worked maybe a couple of years ago. They were way more basic than they are today, right? So that's the process of accelerated Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. Basically, a new algorithm comes, it overcomes some of the limitations of the previous one, and of course it takes over and then over and over by new versions. So looking at the evolution of LLMs in the last 2 years gives us a very good estimate of what's going to happen when we begin enabling AI-driven weapons, which is very, very rapid progress and improvement. But of course, this improvement is an improvement in lethality, and that's what makes this very, very scary. Because at the end of the day, of course, there's a whole ethics layer on any sort of AI weapon, which is, who pulls the trigger? Who is going to make the final decision to go for the kill, And of course, the first thing you need to do is you need to establish some sort of terminology so that we can talk about this in a proper way, So currently there's 3 approaches, from most restrictive to least restrictive. So the first approach is what's called human in the loop. Human in the loop, it means that a human approves every shot. By default, the weapon is not allowed to shoot unless a human makes that decision. So of course the AI can track targets, it can identify, it can prioritize, but the moment of shooting is actually decided by a human. Of course, this is the most safe because we know that every decision to kill is going to be made by a human. But of course, there's going to be a slowdown. Remember, a battlefield typically sometimes is not an ideal communication environment. There could be a breach of communication. There could be a disconnection between the operator and the weapon. So what do we do in that case? And so of course, the temptation to remove the human from the loop is very, very high. And so moving on from human in the loop, we go for human on the loop, which is the second layer. In this case, what we're talking about is that the AI has the ability to actually perform the kill autonomously without asking for permission. But basically what happens is that a human can step in to stop it. Okay, so again, in the human in the loop approach, basically by default, the AI will never shoot. It will ask for permission. In the human on the loop, the AI will shoot by default, and it's actually the reverse. It's actually the human who needs to step in and say, hey, stop. Not this one, because you're making a mistake or whatever. This reminds me in a very different context, the way self-driving cars work. The self-driving cars like Teslas and, BMWs and all that, basically they are kind of like on the loop. Basically the car self-drives, and basically at any point the human can step in to stop what's going on. So again, human in the loop, human on the loop, and of course the end of all this is human out of the loop. And that's the moment in which actually we have a fully autonomous weapon system that decides and kills without any sort of human intervention. And of course this removes lag, this removes doubt, and there's zero room for supervision, and authority to perform the kill actually is passed to the machine. And you may think, whoa, careful, this human out of the loop should never happen. What if I told you that actually that can happen already? There was a case in Libya in 2020 called the Kargu 2 incident. The Kargu 2 is a type of drone manufactured by a Turkish company called STM, and by according to a report from a UN panel of experts, and I read from the report, these systems were programmed to engage targets without requiring data connectivity between the operator and the munition. It was a true fire and forget capability. And Business Insider in an article wrote, a deadly drone was able to pursue a human target without being instructed to do so. So again, there are some weapons already out there that have this capacity of behaving in a completely autonomous way. On one side, it does make sense because, as I said, communications in a battlefield can sometimes be non-perfect, and so of course, maybe at some point you are in a situation in which that drone or that munition is not able to communicate with the home base, and so again, the doubt is, okay, does the weapon have permission to actually act? That's really the idea. And actually that is a broader discussion. And for example, the UN, the United Nations has been over a decade debating about the dangers of military AI. And of course, as of today, there is no binding treaty signed by anyone. And again, the reason is what I said before. Let's imagine you're the US. And of course, you're told, hey, let's put some boundaries of what you can or what you cannot do with an AI-enabled weapon. But of course, the US says, yeah, sure. But what about the Chinese? Because maybe they bypass this treaty and they do what we have been told we shouldn't do. Or what about the Russians? What about the North Koreans? You see? So getting people in these times of fear and quick development of new weapons, getting people to commit to not doing certain things is basically a lost battle. Because of course, all the different armies are going to say, yeah, I'm not going to stop my engineering, because if I stop it, maybe the enemy is going to actually do this thing that you're actually banning me to do. And again, so there's this fear, and in this context of fear, of course, there's very, very rapid development of superior weapons on a month-by-month basis. There's a very interesting example, which is called Project Maven. I invite you guys to look it up on Wikipedia. Project Maven, it was a project by the Department of Defense launched in 2017 in the US, and basically the official objective of Project Maven was to use AI to, in their own words, accelerate the chain of death. Basically, make the decision from the moment of deciding to do something to the moment that the target is acquired and the munition is actually deployed, make it as short as possible, identifying targets and assigning them a weapon system and so forth and so on. There was a live fire test of Project Maven in 2020 done in Fort Bragg in the US. For the first time, it was actually put in use. The way this was done, it was an integrated battle scenario in which there was an abandoned tank that was kind of like the decoy, the target, and a satellite detected this abandoned tank, and AI identified that tank as a valid target. A human approved the kill, and basically a HIMARS, which is a type of munition, was automatically fired against this tank, which was the target. So it was the first time that the US did an AI-guided strike in the history of the US military. A fully integrated battle scenario in which all the chain of command was actually done by an AI. And this chain of command would have all the obvious steps, which is identify the goal, locate the goal, validate legally the authority to strike, and this is the step where a human is actually involved in the process, prioritize, assign the fire units, which is the munition that's going to be deployed to deal with that threat, and of course shoot the weapon system to neutralize the threat. There was a study done on Project Maven, basically proving that Project Maven allowed the military to make decisions much faster. Without Maven, it was calculated that a human controller could actually supervise 30 targets per hour. 30 targets per hour was the best that a fully trained individual could actually handle. Maven could actually handle 80 targets per hour, so more than double. It was estimated that during the Iraq War, actually 2,000 people from the US military were assigned to the task of monitoring targets and identifying them and assigning munitions to the different targets. So again, 2,000 people. The people who in charge of Project Maven estimated that with Project Maven, those 2,000 people will actually become 20. Only with 20 people you could actually do the work of 2,000, thanks to the basically power of the AI in assisting the decision-making progress and the acceleration of this kill chain that I was mentioning. If you're interested in Project Maven, please look it up on Wikipedia. There's a wealth of information. And again, Project Maven is not just theory; it was actually used in real scenarios. In 2021, it was used to track targets in the Middle East. 2022, it was used again in Ukraine to detect Russian positions via satellites and actually send that information to the Ukrainians so that they could actually order strikes. And again, in Middle East in 2024, in strikes in Iraq and Syria. So again, this is not sci-fi. This is actually the reality of war, a war that more and more basically involves the use of AI in all the chain of command, be it the command modules like Project Lattice, as I said, from Endural, to the actual weapon systems having autonomy and being able to perform the kill with little or with even no intervention of a human. And of course, that generates huge ethics concerns. There's a classic story, which is in 2028, it was actually leaked, revealed that Google was involved in Project Maven, and over 3,000 employees from Google actually protested this involvement in the Project Maven, and they signed a petition to actually not be involved in that, and they said, we don't want to build technology to kill. I mean, think of this, Google is well known for search engines and all sorts of services, but of course, once Google gets involved in technologies that can be used for killing purposes, of course, that opens many ethical concerns by the team. And remember, of course, Google, as many others, has some of the best engineers in the world when it comes to AI, computer vision, LLMs, etc. So that kind of know-how can be very useful for the military. But of course, there's this ethical concern that I was telling you about. And as a result of that, actually, Google broke the contract with the Pentagon with Project Maven, and it dissolved its AI ethics committee shortly after that. But the reality is that companies like Google, of course, they're some of the most powerful companies in the world, full of PhDs and full of people with huge talents. So of course, once Google stepped away from Project Maven, other companies actually stepped in. And so, for example, it's well known that Microsoft and Palantir, which is another interesting company for you guys to track, are still collaborating with the Pentagon in military and in AI type initiatives. And that takes us to kind of like a forecast of what the future may look like. As we've seen on this video, again, AI is here to stay. It's unavoidable that AI will get involved in the battlefield just because every army in the world will think the same way, and if you don't do it, your enemy will. And so I'm suspecting this is going to lead us to an arms race of AI-enabled munitions. And looking at the future, I was reading an article the other day, and I wanted to share this with you guys about one of the future bombers of the US Army, which is the B-21 Raider. The B-21 is the successor of the B-2. If you checked the news last weeks, remember the B-2 was successfully used a few weeks ago to strike the Fordo nuclear facility in Iran. There was a strong suspicion that in Fordo, Iran, the Iranian regime under a mountain had a secret base, and in that base it had centrifuging nuclear fuel for nuclear weapons, nuclear grade uranium and plutonium, and so the US actually used B-2s to actually strike that facility. So the B-2 is a very expensive weapon system, and so the B-21, which is the future weapon, it's actually more inexpensive to manufacture, and actually it's a little bit smaller, but it still keeps the same stealth capability and the same thermonuclear strike capabilities. So again, we're talking here about a stealth thermonuclear enabled bomber. And so you'll ask, and what does this have to do with AI? Well, if you look at the documentation from the project, which is available, the publicly available information, it seems like the B-22 is going to be deployed in two versions, one of them with a pilot and one of them without a pilot. So here we're talking that in 5-10 years time, we can have a bomber flying without a pilot carrying thermonuclear weapons. And what kind of warfare does that generate for the future? It's a scary thought. We're living in scary times, and it's interesting because basically we are living in a world that more and more looks like science fiction. That's something I tell all my friends. I'm 51. When I was very, very, very young, I still remember doing work for school in a typewriter, in a mechanical typewriter, and here we are talking about a world that looks like science fiction. And the problem with science fiction is that it can be used in a positive and in a negative way. Positive, for example, when we talk about ChatGPT, honestly, to me, ChatGPT is the stuff of dreams. I never thought I would actually interact with an AI the way I interact with ChatGPT. And whenever I look at a cell phone and I look at the computing power we have in the palm of our hands in any of our cell phones, it's just basically mind-blowing. It's impossible to think 15 years ago where we would be in terms of computing power in the palm of our hands. We have the whole history of mankind in the palm of our hands. Think about that, But of course, the problem with progress and the problem with advancements and the problem with innovation is that it goes both ways. It can be used for positive and it can be used for negative. Nothing wrong with the military, but it's obvious that basically an AI-enabled army poses significant questions and significant worries that we should be very, very aware for the future. This is beginning to look like one of those science fiction movies. And again, the difference between the kind of materials that I've shared with you guys today on this video and movies like Terminator is really getting very, very slim. The kind of capabilities and the kind of lethality that we're talking about, it's not only like that movie, but it could actually get much, much worse once we take it to the right scale, the scale of a large army enabled with this kind of weapons, So it feels like we keep opening Pandora's boxes, the Pandora's box from the mythology, But the problem is every time we do one of these advances, there's no back button, there's no undo, there's no Control Z, Control Z is kind of like, undo on Windows. Okay, there is not such a thing, when you invent nuclear weapons, you cannot uninvent them. When you invent LLMs, you cannot uninvent them. When you invent AI-enabled weapons, you cannot uninvent them. And of course, we are a reckless species that basically we explore things, we move in all sorts of directions, sometimes without thinking about the consequences, So of course we will, in the next 2, 3, 5 years, we will develop AI-enabled weapons, and there will be no going back to the world it was even before we created those weapons. So we're entering a new era, and that new era has good things. Again, ChatGPT, the future of medicine with AI, all this kind of stuff. But we're also entering a scary new era when it comes to weapons which could actually kill us with no mercy and with no human in control. That goes to the classic thought, as a parting thought, which is across the history of humanity, technology has never been a problem. Now, the technology is not the problem. It's always the use of that technology. But in this case, it's not only the use, it's something very, very different and very scary, which is once that technology becomes sentient, once this technology possesses intelligence, what if that technology decides that the enemy is you? So this was my video today. This is Decode, my channel where I try to talk about the modern world with no bullshit. We're slowly growing, and thank you so much for those of you who have already subscribed to the channel. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so, because of course, subscribing to the channel basically fosters visibility on the YouTube algorithm. We're still in the early stages. As I've said on previous videos, Decode is my English version of a Spanish channel that I have, which roughly 100,000 followers, and I wanted to create something more for the broader audience across the world. And that's the reason why we have now this English-speaking channel. If you enjoy this type of content on YouTube, please subscribe, so that shows support to me. And of course, here below we can discuss everything that I've said on this video. I think the comments section is where all the debate should be in a civilized manner. So please, point your questions there. Maybe we can talk about new weapon systems. We can talk about papers, and we can talk about new technologies that can be interesting in the field of AI and AI for military purposes. And again, see you on the next video of Decode. Thanks for watching.